The saying says that one picture is worth 1,000 words. And sometimes that can be true. Oftentimes when someone wants you interested in something, they give you a picture that requires little explanation. For instance, what if I wanted you to visit Destin, Florida, on the beach? I might show you this kind of picture. It would require very little explanation. You see the sunset and the water, the couple walking on the beach, and it just almost soothes you just looking at the picture. Or what about something very different? What if I wanted you to eat at somewhere like the Golden Corral? Or old time, I heard more response from that than I did the Destin picture, Pastor Micah. Good grief. There are animals out there. Carnivores. I also. See, it requires very little explanation. It's a picture. Pictures can be powerful to connect with others, to gain their attention, to explain. And I would say today that sharing Christ, sharing salvation with others, often means using word pictures to share our faith. This morning, we're going to take just a little while and talk about painting a picture of salvation for the lost. If you have your Bibles with you, I want you to turn to John chapter 4. John chapter 4. John chapter 4. The Gospel of John was written by the man who was the closest friend to Jesus on earth. In fact, John was often referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And I often like to say, if anyone, John's goal, by the way, was to explain to the lost that Jesus really is God and that Jesus really is the only way to salvation. And if anybody knew that Jesus wasn't actually God, it would have been John. It would have been John in the same way that if I want to know something about you, probably I'd be best not to ask your boss or maybe your boss. But probably it would be better for me to ask your spouse or your closest friend. If you want to know about me, don't think you know about me by coming to hear me preach. Ask my wife. Ask my kids. They know about me. And so the person who's closest to you is going to know the most about you. And John, in writing his gospel, knew that. And so he writes this entire gospel proclaiming Jesus as God. Just in my mind, one more affirmation that the closest friend Jesus ever had, he honestly believed Jesus was God. And so his entire gospel is to that effect. To explain that, well, as we move through the gospel, there is a scene that takes place in John chapter 4 that is unique to John. The other three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are often referred to as the synoptics, and they're very similar in nature and very common. John has a number of different scenes in it that the other three don't have, this being one of them. And what we'll find as we read the scriptures was that Jesus left the area of Judea and Jerusalem, which is the southern part of Israel, and was going to make his way north. And as he did, he stopped off in an area, a town outside of town called Samaria. He stopped outside that town. He actually rested beside a common well where many of the women in the city would come and draw the water every day. The disciples went on in to the city to get food. As Jesus waited by the well, a woman came out. And this woman who came out had a conversation with Jesus that would change her life, that would change the lives of her friends, and as we find out, would literally change the spiritual condition of this entire city to a large degree. This one conversation. But within the conversation, Jesus explaining to the lady about eternal life, about salvation, about heaven. How do you explain these concepts to someone who has not had a lot of interest in them or who knows nothing about them. I mean, literally, how do you explain these abstract, eternal concepts to someone who maybe has had no concern for salvation in the past? Well, oftentimes you do that by painting a picture. Now, maybe you draw a literal picture, or maybe you draw what we call a word picture. Jesus draws a word picture. You could even say he uses an object lesson to communicate to this lady about salvation. So this morning, I want you to consider some steps for painting pictures to the lost. Some steps for painting pictures to the lost about salvation. John chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Jesus. Therefore, verse 1, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, that is, he was growing in notoriety, growing in attention. Parenthetically, in verse 2, he says, though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples. So what we have here is Jesus leading people, and there are so many people being baptized, so many people converting, that he sets his disciples off to baptizing. And they're doing it over and over again, numbers and scores of people. He left Judea. Judea is the southern part of Israel, near Jerusalem, near the Dead Sea. If you have maps in the back of your Bible, you could probably find a map. It would help you. Here's one. In fact, you can see at the very bottom of the map is a large body of water. It's a black and white map, but you can kind of get a picture. At the very bottom of it is a body of water called the Dead Sea. That area is called Judea. At the northern part of the southern region of Israel is Jerusalem. And you see Jerusalem there kind of in the lower middle part of the map. That'll be important here in just a few moments. But Jesus was planning to leave Jerusalem and head north. And at the top of this map, you can see an area, a region called Galilee. Galilee is where Nazareth was located. Nazareth is where Jesus was from, as his hometown. Well, in order to get from Jerusalem to Galilee, if you traveled straight north, you would have to go through an area called Samaria. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Look at verse 4. Again, verse 3, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. But watch this. But he needed to go through Samaria. He needed to go through Samaria. That word need, it just means requirement. It means essential. In Jesus' mind, it was essential that he go through Samaria. Jason, throw that map back up there again. As you look at the area where Jerusalem is, you'll see two lines coming out from it going north. One line is green, and one line is like a bluish color. The bluish color, the darker bluish color, everybody see that? Normally, in that day, when Jews left from Jerusalem to go to Galilee, they would follow that dark blue line, or that darker blue line. They would follow that line all the way across the Jordan River, head north, and come back across. They would go miles and miles out of their way just so they would not have to go through Samaria. Say, what was the problem with Samaria? It was full of Samaritans, that's what. It was an incredibly racial matter. You see, years ago, centuries prior to Jesus' time, the Israelites had been exiled into a foreign land. And literally many of them had been picked up and carried off to a foreign nation. And then after a period of time, many of those Jews had been allowed to return. But as they returned, many of those Jews began to intermarry with Gentiles in this area. And so what was worse to the Jewish people at that time than Gentiles? What was worse was Jews who had intermingled with a racially mixed marriage, if you will. And you thought that was just an issue for our day. Folks, Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. And so what you have in Samaria is what the Jews often called half-breeds. You had racially mixed marriages and families, and they wanted nothing to do with the Samaritans. So much so that if they had to travel north, folks, it would be like going to Atlanta through Augusta, going around Macon, hitting Augusta, and coming back to Atlanta, going to Chattanooga via Birmingham. I mean, it's miles and miles out of your way, and yet the average Jew at that time would easily have seen the need to go out of their way to get to Galilee. And yet Jesus says, it says here about him, he didn't see his need to go across the Jordan and out of the way. He saw the need to go through Samaria. A totally contradictory plan to what the average Jewish person would have intended to do at that time. Now you saw the light green line going straight north. That's the line Jesus would take. And verse 4 here in John says he needed to go through Samaria. You say, well, pretty sure, Pastor Johnny. He needed to go through Samaria because he didn't want to go out of his way and spend all that time. Well, that's not exactly the reason. What we'll find here in just a moment is that he needed to go through Samaria because there was someone who needed to meet him. Verse 5. So he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there, so this is a historic area. This is an area that goes way back into the to the history of the Israelites in importance and magnitude. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour, which would make it high noon. This well was outside the city, and normally the ladies would come out in the cool of the day, early in the morning or sometimes in the evenings. Nevertheless, no one came out to this well at high noon. Those of us who live in Georgia and live through the months of July and August understand what it means to go out at high noon and do anything from noon till about 3 or 4 o'clock. Some of the hottest parts of the day, even out to about 5 o'clock. But here, Jesus sat by the well at high noon, which brings me to my first thought. Step 1 in painting a picture for the lost involves this: being prepared in the everyday. Being prepared in the everyday. Jesus is simply making a trip from Judea to Galilee. No big deal, right? We might say, well, Pastor, I got to go up to Atlanta today and I'll be back. No big deal. It's just, for many, it was a normal thing. Now, certainly their trips took much longer than our trips do today, but it was not an unusual thing to travel to go to Galilee. Yet in Jesus' case, he took the normal, the ordinary, and make it extraordinary. He's heading north on a trip to Galilee. His disciples, quite frankly, they're not aware that anything special is about to happen. They're just going back to Galilee, right? Going back home. It's nice visiting Jerusalem. It's nice visiting Judea. But it's awfully nice going back home, sleeping in your own bed, right? Just normal stuff. But on this very normal day, this very everyday, something extraordinary is about to happen. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever left your house in the morning, had your day planned out, and by the end of the day, something or some things had happened that totally turns your world upside down? And when you left that morning, you had absolutely no anticipation that something of such magnitude was to take place, whether good or bad. Has that ever happened to any of you? I guess it's happened to every one of us at some point, right? You left in the morning, okay, I've got to run by, I've got to drop off the cleaning, go on to work. At lunchtime, I'm going to do this. After work, we've got this plan, take the kids here. We're going to carry the kids over here, come back. And you've got the day planned. It's just an everyday. It's just a normal day. An average day. How many of you know that God does His work in the mundane of the everyday? In most cases. Very rarely do we anticipate something extraordinary happening. Now, the shuttle launch, the Olympics, There are certain events that we know about, that we can prepare for, we know are coming. But in most cases, the extraordinary things that happen during our day, we don't know about when the day begins. They happen just during the everyday. And so, how many of you know tomorrow, Monday, is there a more mundane day than Monday? If there is, I don't know what it is. And so, how many of you know tomorrow, you know everyone you'll come in contact with? How many of you have any idea whether or not you might come in contact with someone whose life you might change for eternity in the everyday? Ladies and gentlemen, might I suggest that it's important that as we go out into a day, the mundane, in fact, about 98% of where we live is the mundane. It's just the everyday stuff. Doctor's appointments, dentist appointments, going to work, got to stop by and vote, got to go by and pick up my tags. It's almost my birthday. I mean, it's just the normal mundane. Got to run by and get some milk, get supper started. The mundane is mostly where we operate. We talk a lot about magnificent, extraordinary things, but quite frankly, the mundane is the 99% of our lives. And that's okay. Because God does extraordinary things in the everyday lives of people, and we must be prepared. If something came up tomorrow where you cross paths with someone that you can share Christ with, and make no mistake about it, you will. Are you prepared to use a picture, a word picture to explain the gospel to that person? Being prepared in the everyday. What are you waiting on? I'm waiting on when the day's really big. I'm waiting on what are you waiting on? As long as you have breath, and as long as you're saved, you're qualified to be able to share Christ with someone. That's step one, being prepared in the everyday. Jesus was. He's heading north. No big deal. Look at verse 7. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Let me stop there for just a moment. This woman, there are three major reasons he should not be having this conversation with her. Three major reasons. And could I add this? Jesus cared very little about the kind of person that he talked with about eternity. He cared little about their background. He cared little about their economic level. He cared little about their skin color. He cared little about how much they smelled, good or bad. That really was not an issue for Jesus one way or another. In the Church of Jesus Christ, we tend to gravitate to those who are most like us. And in reality, when we reach heaven, that simply won't be the case. It'll be a very diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic looking group of people. I pray, I doubt you would ever come out and say this, but I pray that even in the back of your mind, there's not that group of people that you know you'll share with, but beyond a certain boundary, you'd never come out and say it. But at the same time, you'd never really make the effort to share with certain people who look a certain way, who smell a certain way, who come from a certain background. Jesus cared very little for those things. Say, how do I know? Well, let me tell you about this woman. Number one, she was a woman. Jesus was often seen as a rabbi, and the rabbis of that day would not talk to women. In fact, their moniker or their philosophy was talk to no woman. If necessary, talk to your wife at times. That's not my philosophy. Let me just clarify. That was theirs. Women stayed silent at the time. That's the way it worked. So all of a sudden, this man who was seen as a rabbi was talking to this woman. So that was one mark against her. Second, we're going to find out that she is an immoral woman. In fact, she was so immoral that even her community had marked her off. I'm not talking about the church. She was an outcast in her own community. How do I know that? Because she was showing up at the well at a high noon. It was incredibly hot. Most of the women came to the well in the cool of the day. They came, that was their social hour. They would come, get their water, share, talk, share recipes, talk about, well, you know, little Jimmy, he's got this rash on his leg. I don't know what it is. Well, honey, have you ever tried this kind of cream? And they would share thoughts and ideas and secrets. And, you know, my husband, he just doesn't talk to me anymore. And her friend would say, well, nobody's husband talks to him. And they would just share with each other, right? So why was this woman showing up at a time of the day when no one came to the well? Did she just like being by herself? Did she just like being ostracized? Did she just like being marginalized? Nobody likes that. She came because nobody wanted her there. She showed up because nobody wanted her there. And so she came when nobody else was there. This lady, who knows how she felt about life, the disappointment. And she wasn't proud of what she had done. It was life. So not only was she a woman, but she was an immoral woman, not even talked to by the only people in her community, let alone Jesus Christ, who was God. And then finally, she was a Samaritan. I just explained to you a few minutes ago what Samaritans were, how they were viewed by the Jewish people of the time. They were half-breeds. So she was a woman, she was immoral, she was a Samaritan. And quite frankly, Jesus really didn't care. And if that doesn't get your attention as to whether or not Jesus cared about where people were from, He didn't care about where they were from, whether they were poor or whether they were rich, whether they were powerful or whether they were powerless. In fact, if you look into John 3, don't turn there, but just in John 3, and also an incredible conversation takes place with a man named Nicodemus. And Nicodemus was everything this woman was not. Nicodemus talked with Jesus in Jerusalem, the place where all the Jews wanted to go. The woman talked with Jesus in Samaria, the place where nobody of the Jews wanted to go. Nicodemus talked to Jesus by night. The woman talked to him in the midst of the day. Nicodemus planned his visit with Jesus, it seems. The woman, it was simply by chance, although we know it wasn't by chance, was it? It said Jesus needed to go through Samaria. The initiator of the conversation with Jesus by Nicodemus was Nicodemus. The woman, Jesus initiated the conversation. The ethnic group of Nicodemus was Jewish. The woman was Samaritan. The social status of Nicodemus was a highly respected teacher. The woman was despised and immoral. Nicodemus was a man. The Samaritan, she was a woman. The attitude of Nicodemus was somewhat polite, even calling Jesus rabbi. We'll see here as we read, the woman's first response toward Jesus was almost unconcerned, hostility, suspicion. It would become respect. Nicodemus faded out. And actually the dialogue with Jesus became a monologue. The woman continued her dialogue with Jesus all the way to the end. First time in her life she got to talk to a man, she's going to take advantage of it, right? And the result, well, later on we find out that Nicodemus does come to Christ when he comes to get the body of Jesus at Jesus' death. But in John 3 we have no record of his conversion. But in John 4 the woman is converted, and we'll see this in just a moment. So we see the contrast between Nicodemus in John 3 and the woman in John 4. And what I'm telling you is, in John 3, Jesus shares with a man who becomes converted, who is wealthy and powerful and highly esteemed. In John 4, Jesus shares with a woman who's converted, and she's poor and immoral and despised. He doesn't care where you're from. He doesn't care what you look like. He doesn't care what your hair color is, what your skin color is, what your economic level is, what your bank account is. He just doesn't care. That's good talk. By God's grace, we'd be a church that walks that out. I'm so tired of hearing it. I want to see it. So Jesus, picking up in verse 10, Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Verse 10, Jesus for the first time lays a picture out to the woman, right? picture is water. You don't have to be omniscient to know that water was important to this lady. I mean, she came out every day to gather water from the well. And so Jesus initiates this picture with the image of water. The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water?" I don't know if you noticed the tone, but it went from verse 9, which was a little suspicious, maybe even hostility, and now all of a sudden inquisitive. Verse 12, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? Jesus answered and said to her, "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again." Drinks, present active participle, drinks and keeps on drinking. No matter how much you drink it, ultimately you'll be thirsty. And he's speaking of the physical water. Verse 14, "But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst." Watch this. "But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life." There's a difference between a bucket that draws water out and a spring that produces water. Jesus said, "Lady, I got something for you. You've been coming out here every day with buckets to draw water, and I'm telling you, no more buckets. If you get the water I'm talking about, I will install a spring within you, and it will manufacture water instead of having to go out every day and draw it in yourself." He has now moved from an everyday picture, which, by the way, is step 2. If step 1 was being prepared in the everyday, step 2 is borrowing a picture from the everyday. When you're sharing Christ with someone, you can use all the terms you want: salvation, eschatology, numerology, a millennium, revelation. You can share all those words, but how about taking a picture from the everyday to be able to explain to someone about salvation? And that's what Jesus is doing. And he takes the picture from the everyday and moves to the spiritual, borrowing a picture from the everyday. And the woman said, "Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw." And I can just see her looking at her hands with the calluses and the cuts and the splinters and all that she did to pull the rope up and down to draw the water. The blisters and the calluses on her feet to walk back and forth every day to draw water. "Give me water." Now at this point, she still had this water on her mind, right? But Jesus was trying to take her from there to the spiritual water. If at this point, Jesus just began to discuss eternity and the millennium and theological ideas, I don't know that he would have kept this woman. I think he would have lost her. But what he does, look at verse 16. Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." Now stop there. He's taking an everyday picture and using it. And he's not trying to take her into some deep theological discussion. He's trying to take an everyday picture and use it to communicate salvation. This past Tuesday, on Tuesday mornings, we gather together. We have a men's prayer meeting. We've now started gathering in the C Hall conference room. By God's grace, if God moved among our men, I'd love to see us have to move into C101. But anyway, that's another story. But on 6:30 on Tuesday mornings, we gather for our men's prayer meeting. And this last Tuesday, we had someone share about a gentleman that they had talked to about the Lord in the parking lot of a grocery store or some store this past week. Said the man walked up to him and asked if he had 50 cents. So that was an odd amount. It was a very small amount. Of course, I guess if you asked 100 people that, then you could get enough to eat on the day or whatever. But he asked for 50 cents. And as we were talking, the man who shared this story said, I don't normally give money to people who ask. I might buy them food or whatever, but I was prompted. I said, "I'll tell you what," and he pulled out a gospel tract. He said, "I have 50 cents right here, but you have to read this gospel tract." Oh, now, Pastor, that's manipulation. No, that's bargaining. Here's what the man knew. If he'd begun to explain to him eschatology and the millennium and salvation and some of the terms that we use, he would have probably listened because he had to and not heard a thing. But what he knew is, if I read this gospel tract, I'll get that 50 cents. That makes sense to him. That made a lot of sense. It's simply taking an everyday picture and using it to share the gospel. So step 2 in painting this picture is borrowing a picture from the everyday. When you're talking with someone about the Lord, don't get incredibly complex. Don't try to take a picture they don't understand. Now, if you're speaking to a rocket scientist, you might be able to take some simple ideas about that, about engineering or about aerodynamics. Don't try to use a picture you don't know anything about, then you just sound dumb. But I'm telling you, take a picture that person can understand. If they're a musician, you can use music. If they're a nurse, you can use ideas of medicine or the physical nature of the person. There's so many ways, but take a picture from the everyday and share the gospel. And then step number 3, bring the picture to the eternal day. Verse 16, Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have well said, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband, in that you spoke truly." He said, "Lady, I know he's not your husband. You've had 5 husbands. The guy you're with now, you're living with. You're not even married to him." This lady never told Jesus that. He just moved her from water. He's now moving her to think about eternal things. The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." No kidding, lady. You better believe it. Verse 20, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship." And Jesus said this, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father." See, there was a divide. Many said you need to worship in Samaria. And others said, no, you got to worship in Jerusalem. And there was a division between them. And Jesus said, I'm going to tell you something. There's a day coming. It ain't going to matter about those places. Worship will radically change for everybody. You worship, verse 22, you worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers, it's not about Samaria, it's not about Jerusalem. The true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. He has now taken it to a spiritual place, to an eternal place. See, if you just take an everyday picture and you leave it there, if you just take an everyday picture just to meet the need, and you don't take the person on to spiritual thoughts, to eternal thoughts, to salvation, you've not done your job. The church is not primarily a social ministry. We are primarily a gospel ministry. Not too long ago, I had some folks approach me about doing a ministry. And one thing I found is too often Christians seem to err on one side or the other. We either run roughshod over the ideas of the person in front of us, and we get to our presentation regardless of whether that person will understand us or not. Because we're going to get to the presentation, and we miss their needs entirely. And then sometimes we err on the other end of the spectrum. We're so concerned about meeting needs that we really don't get to the real need, which is the gospel. Either way, I think we're off base. Well, what about the person who's caught up in his own thoughts? I've literally seen those who are so eloquent in their words. They're caught up in their own presentation. They blurt out the gospel and completely miss the opportunity to meet that lost person's need and connect with them where they are. Kind of like this.
Presenting Real Christians of Genius.
Real Christians of Genius.
Today we salute you, Mr. Christianese speaking person.
Mr. Christianese speaking person.
When conventional wisdom said no one can understand what you're communicating, you dared to prove them wrong.
Dared to prove them wrong.
You knew your neighbor didn't know words like Trinity, salvation, and eschatology, but you overused them anyway.
You can't stop me now.
When people told you what they believed, you had the guts to laugh in their face and wish them luck in everlasting retribution.
You gotta be kidding.
So stand proud, chosen one. Yea, though your words confuse the masses, thou knowest what thy meaneth.
Thou knowest what thou meanest.
Sometimes if we're not careful, we're so concerned about presenting our case that we miss the person in front of us. When we're sharing the gospel with someone, it is a person. There are needs there. There are desires. There are things that they have needs to meet. Maybe it's a hunger. Maybe it's a thing. But what we've got to be able to do is determine that person in front of us. What is their need? And connect on that level. And so sometimes if we're not careful, we'll mess up by simply running roughshod over the needs of this person. Now the flip side is sometimes we err on the other end of the spectrum where all we're concerned about is meeting social needs. And quite frankly, I see this as much in the church as I do the other end. Recently I had some folks, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, come by and share with me about a ministry they have that reaches out to homeless families. And they talked to me about maybe being a church, a part of that ministry. And I talked with them about it. We sat down and they had me because I felt like this type of ministry really dovetailed well with the kinds of ministries that Green Acre is doing and God's given us open doors to do in so many ways. And we talked for a while and they presented it to me. And at one point, one of the people presenting it said, well, there's one thing we want to make sure you know. One thing we do ask our churches is that they really refrain from sharing the gospel. My eyes got wide and I said, you're going to need to explain that to me because I think you just lost me there. And they went on to explain that they were okay with churches passively maybe leaving a Bible out or so forth, but actually going and presenting the gospel to the individuals to whom we were ministering, they really wanted us to refrain from that. Ladies and gentlemen, helping homeless families is a wonderful thing. But in 1,000 years, whether they lived in a mansion or in a car, is not going to matter as much as what they did with Jesus Christ. And so, yes, we want to meet people's needs and minister to them socially. We want to help those who are homeless. We want to help those who are hungry. We want to help those who need to learn or maybe illiterate. But ultimately, we want to take that and present Christ to them because of it. And so we need to bring the picture to the eternal day. We draw the picture from the everyday, but then we bring them to the eternal day. Don't just leave it in the everyday. Now bring them to the eternal day. And finally, verse 25, the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. Final step, bring the person to Jesus' way. You prepare, day in and day out, prepared for the everyday. You borrow a picture from the everyday. You bring the picture then into the eternal day. And then finally, you want to make sure you bring the person to Jesus' way. Because ultimately, when it's all said and done, all that will matter is what those people did with Jesus Christ. So we're not to leave them with just some kind of an idea about the object lesson. Neither are we to run past them and paint some difficult, abstract picture that they can't connect with, but we are to be able to take the time to care enough about them, to bring them along and finally present Christ to them. It may take more than one meeting, by the way. You say, Pastor, but what if I only have 30 seconds? It's probably an entirely different message. Tell you the truth. Maybe you only have 30 seconds. Maybe all you can do is leave a tract. Maybe all you can do is leave something for them to share the gospel. And I'm talking about when you have an opportunity to share the gospel, take the time to care about the person, to see what kind of needs they may have, to present an everyday picture, and then ultimately to walk them through into the eternity and into Jesus Christ. And that's sharing the gospel. Inviting people to church is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing. I wish you would do it. I hope you're doing it. Telling people about your church is a wonderful thing if God's doing, but ultimately that's not sharing the gospel. Sharing the gospel is taking a person who has a need, explaining to them in a way they can understand, using an everyday picture, and then moving them over to the thoughts of eternity and ultimately to Jesus Christ. That's painting a picture of salvation to the lost. And I'm wondering how many of you sitting out there today have had opportunities to share the gospel and maybe missed them. You look back and you think, I had this opportunity, man, I just missed it. I didn't think about it. Didn't do. Or maybe right now you're sharing Christ with someone and you're praying, God, give me the images I need to be able to communicate it accurately and clearly to them. Or maybe you're the one. You need Christ today. I'm going to pray. The praise team's going to come on up. And we're going to give you an opportunity to respond in just a few moments. Pray with me. Father, right now in Jesus' name, I'm asking, Lord, that you would move in our hearts, cause us to respond in a way that would be in obedience to you, that would see lives changed eternally for the glory of the Father and for the kingdom. Right now, where you're sitting, I'm just going to ask you to stand right where you are. Just stand right where you are.